Hello everyone, Steve Goodwin here with anchor test number 132. Today we're going to look at the 20-pound range anchors in a veering test in the clean sand seabed. Now this protocol is a straight ahead set at 500-pound baseline. Then the test boat is allowed to swing all the way through 180 degrees. We've got a down view of the camera and we'll look for rollouts, pop-outs, or maybe the anchors will stay put. After that 180 degrees of veer, the test boat is straightened out and increased in thrust up to its maximum, and again we watch and see if these anchors can stay put or not. Now a lot of this footage has been viewed or presented previously in my individual tests of these anchors, but not all of it. There's several of these anchors that the footage has not been presented. I will say that all of the rankings and ratings has been put forth in previous charts. However, this is the first time that I've put all of this visual images together back to back. And not only did it help, or will it help you, it helped me in sort of tweaking these rankings a bit. There weren't big adjustments, but the ability to watch these footages back to back, especially with that speeded up playback speed, really does help in assessing just which anchor ranks better compared to the others. So not much more to say. Let's just get right to it. Enjoy. Okay, we'll start off with the anchor that is without question the worst performer in this seabed. It is a 23-pound Lumar Claw. So the protocol that I shoot for with this test is to ramp up thrust in a straight line initially up to about 500 pounds, but this anchor could not do it, nowhere near. In fact, anything over about 200 pounds and this anchor was off in motion. A couple times it was sort of holding 215 pounds, like about right here. So I started a veer, but right away it just started moving faster and faster. Notice that these low pulling numbers, that the chain is not lifted at all above the seabed. So in effect we have infinite scope. Adding scope or adding more chain will do nothing to improve the situation. It's just already being pulled horizontally, and that is as good as it gets. Next best anchor is a 21-pound genuine Bruce. Of course, the previous anchor, that Claw, is a copy of this genuine article. And the main difference that I can see that causes the difference in performance is that the leading edges and basically all the structures of this anchor are thinner and or sharper. And it just does better. Still not great, but as you can see here, the shank is down near the level of the seabed, and in fact at some point it gets covered completely. I won't say it buried itself wholly, because there is a little bit of a mounding or heaping going on, so I think just sand is sort of fallen away from those sort of lumps on either side of the anchor and partially covering the fluke. So it did better, but still not great. This is the first try for this anchor, and it would not hold the 500 pounds of thrust. In fact, anything over about 300, and it would take off. So I went ahead and redeployed the anchor fully, just to make sure it's got a nice, clean, fair shot, and established a new baseline. I'm just going to try for 315 pounds of veering pull. And it was more or less holding that initially, but as soon as I started veering, and again, the boat here was moving to starboard, or it's moving to the left in your screen. The anchor just was repeatedly having partial releases, lots of motion. So once again, a pretty poor performance. Again, noticeably better than the Claw, but nothing to write home about. Now this substrate appears to be nice and clean, loose sand. However, some anchors do occasionally come up with a clump of some sand that must obviously have some binder in it, and for sure there is binder at some level. But this time, nothing on the anchor, nice and clean, just a few little weeds. Next anchor is the 22-pound roll bar Rocna. Now this initial shot here of the set is at real-time speed, but I'm going to show you the full sequence uninterrupted starting now at 8 times camera speed. And the story here is that the anchor just never quits moving. Lots and lots of motion, never fully buries completely. Does have quite a bit of seabed heaped up in front of the roll bar. I did execute the test at the target of 500 pounds of thrust. So I did execute a veer, but it was, again, lots of motion, and from the top side it felt like it was releasing at times, but it did always re-engage the seabed. It did make it through 180 degrees, and then at the final straight line portion, the anchor was moving at 2 knots at about 700 pounds of thrust. So fair, but not great. You'll see other anchors that do much better. I did give this anchor a whole nother try, which I'll show you some clips of, and initially it was very, very similar in that it set right away, did have continuous motion at 500 pounds and throughout the veer. However, it didn't make it all the way through the veer. Toward the end, there was a full release and no reset. And I'm going to show you the aftermath of that. It has nothing to do with this Rocna. This could have happened to virtually any anchor. And that is it picked up a hitchhiker. It had impaled a shell right on the tip of the anchor. So there, right on the toe of the anchor, we see that shell that has been impaled. I've said it could happen to virtually any anchor, and now that I think of it, a Bruce or Claw probably wouldn't be likely to have this happen because there is no point to sort of poke a hole into the shell. On retrieval, we'll see it there once again, but it does fall away before it reached the surface. Next anchor is the 24-pound Delta. Unfortunately, the camera tether was fouled, so we don't get to see the anchor during the veer portion. We do see a nice family of crabs scurrying about. I was able to tell that the anchor was continuously moving through that 180 degrees of veer, but it wasn't a lot of motion, so that was good. However, during the straight line portion and the ramp up, the anchor was moving continuously, and it just kept moving faster and faster. And it was at about 1,200 pounds of thrust that the anchor was, or the boat was making about 2 knots on the GPS. Now, if you look closely at the top of the screen, you'll notice that the chain is no longer lying on the seafloor. There is still quite a bit of catenary, and the angle of pull is being helped by the presence of chain, but again, it was being lifted off from the seabed. Next anchor is the 17-pound Mantis M1. Notice there is a strap connecting the roll bar to the shank. That is to just simply beef it up. These anchors will bend the roll bar back under very, very high loads. Certainly normal circumstances that wouldn't be an issue, but I have bent this roll bar back in a high load test. So now we're watching the playback at 8 times speed. We're right in the middle of the veer at 500 pounds of thrust. The boat's moving to starboard, and the anchor's not moving much at all. It's a really good performance. However, at the 120 degree mark, the anchor released, and you saw it there, it just popped right out. It did reset, which was very good. And then during the straight line portion, the anchor was hanging in there at the maximum that this boat can pull, which is 1,150 pounds. Wasn't going 2 knots, but, you know, it's going to be up to you if you want to think that that is usable holding or not. Certainly a sustained wind with that kind of motion, and you could certainly move perhaps onto rocks or some other obstruction. On the retrieval, we do see a bit of mud still clinging to the anchor, some shells also. As I said, there is some binder when you dig down deep enough, and this anchor apparently was able to find some of that more clingy sand. Next anchor is the 17-pound XL1. After this initial set, I'm going to increase the playback speed to 8 times, and you'll have to watch real carefully because there is a release at the 60 degree mark of the veer. Here we are veering to starboard now, and yeah, not a lot of motion. It's just doing wonderful, and if it could have stuck with it, it would have been great, but it did just pop out there. However, the anchor resets immediately and finished out the veer just great, and in the straight line portion it was equally well. In fact, it was better than that Mantis M1 in that it wasn't moving as fast. I'm going to call this slow, steady motion, and right up to the max what this test boat can pull, 1,150 pounds. I will say that was usable holding. Again, if it was an extremely long duration wind event, maybe that you'd move significantly, but no, that was usable holding up into the thousands. And I'll take a wild guess at an equivalent wind speed for, say, a 25-knot boat. Let's say roughly, very roughly, maybe 60 knots of wind for a 1,000 or 1,100-pound pull. Next anchor is the 26-pound genuine CQR anchor. I have tested this anchor fully, and you've seen the full footage of this in a previous test. It is a virtually brand new anchor. At this time, it had hardly ever been used. Therefore, the hinge has not worn out, so we've just got a perfect example here. And perfect was almost the way it handled this Veer. There was continuous small motion, but this is the first anchor that I've shown you today that did not have a significant problem in either the Veer or the straight line ramp up. It just stayed engaged, not a lot of motion, and just did great. This anchor has never shown any tendency to foul with seabed. It's just got those smooth curved flukes. There's nothing to hang up mud on, and just did great. Here we are in the straight line portion, and there is more motion. I would say that XL was certainly better. Certainly it's a lot smaller. It was only 17 pounds, and this 26-pounder obviously has an advantage. On the retrieval, it did shed its mud just right away, and in the roller, absolutely nothing on the anchor. 500-pound baseline. Next anchor is a 22-pound quick set, and it was similar to that CQR that we just watched. Maybe not quite as good in the Veer, because you'll see it does have a bit of motion at the midpoint, but it settles back down, never releases. I'll rate it real similar to the CQR, because once again, that CQR at 26 pounds had a significant advantage. So here at this portion, boy, there's no motion at all. That anchor was staying absolutely put, and if it could have hung in there, that would have been a 5 out of 5 for the veering, but nope, it started moving a bit more, again, about the halfway point of a 180-degree Veer. Right there, starting to move faster. But like I say, it settled back down, and then from then it was very stable, stayed upright, and not a lot of motion. In the straight line ramp-up portion, it held the full amount of this test boat, which is 1,325 pounds. Shouldn't say held, it was resisting, because it never quit moving, but I'll say that that was usable holding power. Like that CQR, this anchor sheds mud just as good as any anchor I have seen. Next anchor is the 21-pound Spade S60 in galvanized steel. Anchor set just great on the initial portion, ramped right up to the 500-pound target, started the Veer, but it did have some motion. I won't say it was a perfect Veer. Got the camera up at 8 times speed. We saw the anchor was lifted up there briefly, coincided with more motion, then it settled right back down. Then in the straight line portion, the anchor was interfered with by what I believe to be a man-made object. We see the crab there, but that goes away. Nope, right there we see a mass of some sort. I think it's foam. That's my best guess. I did show this to my father, who was a marine biologist, and he spent his whole career scouring the bottom of these waters, and he'd never seen any organic material like that before. That was not alive. So I think it was some kind of a cushion, maybe foam. In any event, I think it was the reason that the anchor did release there, but the anchor reset immediately after getting through that piece of foam and held wonderfully. Very, very little motion. The best holding of any anchors so far that I've shown you in this series. Five to 1 scope, 30-foot water, 150 road. This is the 21-pound Rocna Vulcan anchor. It's a very solid performer here. We're getting toward the end of the list. There's only 3 more that I'm showing you, and it's debatable about which one is best. But I am gonna continue with this presentation in the order that I feel these anchors performed best. The anchor did dive right out of sight, and here we are in the veering portion. Boat's pulling at 535 pounds, moving to port this time, and even at this 8 times playback speed, very little motion. I won't say it's the absolute best, but it's darn close. And then in the initial straight line ramp-up portion, again, not a lot of motion, just a touch. We'll see here shortly that we do experience the plunging camera phenomenon. That occurs when the anchor is so deep that enough seabed sort of piles up on the tether, and sure enough, down the anchor goes. This is at 1,325 pounds that occurred. Very little motion. Did pick up some seabed, but by the time it came to the surface, it had all fallen away. So it's an anchor that's unlikely to clog. Next anchor is the 21-pound Sarka XL2. This is in galvanized steel. These anchors might take just a hair longer to set. They're fairly light on their tip, and their geometry might just be that they take just a little bit longer to set, but I think it's kind of immaterial. It's obviously a very fast set. But the real story here is the quality of the veer for this anchor. We're up at 8 times camera speed, and now we're starting the boat veering to starboard. And you're going to see the anchor, or where the camera tether goes into the seabed, it just isn't moving. And we see a nice sort of a windshield wiper stripe arcing right around. And that, my friends, doesn't get any better in terms of veering. That is perfection. That anchor just didn't go anywhere. We see the initial setting mark right to the right of the picture. Maybe I veered just a little bit more than 180 degrees. Now the anchor has sort of traveled back through its initial setting spot, and very, very little motion on the ramp up as well. So it's just nearly perfect in both the veer and the holding power. Now keep in mind, this test boat only makes 1,150 pounds of thrust. And I'm going to give the anchor another try. It's the same day, same test boat, same seabed, everything's the same. Just want to make sure that maybe the anchor wasn't just getting lucky in that perfect veer on the first attempt. Once again, we're 8 times camera speed. We're ramping up to the 500-pound baseline, and the anchor will be veering to port this time. So we see the chain at the top of the screen moving to the left. And sure enough, once again, I don't see that anchor moving much at all. I've got a nice sort of a windshield wiper stripe transcribing in the seabed. And again, once again, that is as good as it gets. 2 for 2, perfection on the veering portion. However, the straight line portion was not as good this time. What we're going to see is the anchor has rolled a bit, and shortly the anchor starts moving. And we start to see a lump of seabed to the left of its track. So I think the anchor, again, has rolled, and part of the fluke is getting close to the surface. I've got the camera speed, or the playback speed, back to real time now. And sure enough, we get the plunging camera tether. That's a good sign that the anchor has kind of gone upside down. But the anchor composes itself and resets and stops the boat real nicely. It didn't go far there, but certainly that takes it out of the running for best in holding power category for this test. We see things have settled right down, but once again, we're going to see a bit of evidence of rolling again. The anchor will be making a lump, so to speak, off to the side of its setting track. It's certainly nothing new. I've noticed this phenomenon with XL anchors numerous times in other seabeds as well. That they always make really good, very high holding power, but near their maximum, they sometimes, not always, will roll. And sure enough, here we are. We're getting that second rolling event. Again, I think that fluke is just under the surface to one side, and again, we get the plunging camera tether. Didn't quite take the camera all the way into the seabed, and that completes the test. So not perfect in terms of holding power, but certainly its ability to withstand these veers is phenomenal. Okay, we're getting down to the wire. This is the second to the last anchor. It's the 17-pound Mantis M2. This is about 20% less weight than these other top anchors. Again, the other ones were up to 21 pounds, and this is the only 17-pounder here at the top of this test. And top of this test, it certainly deserves to be, because it executes this Veer just perfectly. It's got a 500-pound baseline. Again, it's only 20% less weight anchor, but it doesn't matter. It just stays absolutely still. It doesn't really move anywhere throughout that Veer. Just perfect. Now, here on the straight line portion, pretty early, nowhere near the maximum thrust of the boat, the anchor rolls. We get the plunged camera, but here shortly, it emerges. Now, I'll slow the camera down to quarter speed, and up near the top of the screen, you can just see the ear of the fluke. Go back and rewind it if you want, but one ear of the fluke was emerged from the seabed, and then I continued ramping up power, and motion continued. It never stopped. Again, this boat pulls 1,150 pounds. That's a very, very good holding performance, but not perfect. Which brings us to the best anchor for this test series, and that is the 21-pound Viking 10. Now, Viking anchors are no strangers to top spots in many of my tests. They really do perform well in these underwater tests. The anchor doesn't bury fully here in the initial part. All through the Veer, we'll see the top of the roll bar. It is a very tall roll bar. And here, now that the boat is swinging to starboard, we see a perfect arc transcribing in the seabed, and the anchor is just basically pivoting. The second half of this arc, though, there's just a touch of motion. I think the arc that's transcribing elongates a bit, and the anchor maybe moves an anchor length. So it's near perfect, but just not quite as good as a couple of those other anchors that we just saw a moment ago. But it's this straight line portion that's really, really well. It does really well. I think it's perhaps the best of the day. The anchor does go out of sight there. I think part of that's because there's a little bit of a heaped material in front of the roll bar, but truly excellent holding there for these 20-pound range anchors. I'd like to get back, maybe do the winch test for all these 20-pounders. As we know, I can pull 5,000 pounds, and that might just separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of holding in this seabed. Here's a look at the latest 20-pound range resistance or holding graph. And I don't have time to go through all these with you, but let's focus on those magenta or purple bars. That is the clean sand data for the test we just saw. Notice that there are arrows on the top of many of those anchors, and I'll just re-explain this. I say re-explain because I've actually shown you this same graph at on a previous test, but again, the arrows indicate anchors that were basically making usable holding or resistance up at the maximum that that particular test boat could pull. And as we know, these are this is sort of a holding factor based on the weight of the anchor, and these arrows are not going to be all at the same height because we're looking at different anchor weights and also two different test boats. Again, one pulls about 1,150 pounds and the other one 1,325. So we don't really know what the holding is for any of those arrowed anchors, but the ones without arrows, I think we've got a pretty good idea of what their maximum is for this seabed. Here's the latest ranking chart for the 20-pound range anchors. We see the Viking 10 there at the top of the chart. We do see it is sharing the total average with a couple other anchors. They all get 4s, but the performance average, clearly the Viking 10 is a bit better than all the rest. It's the same story with the larger anchors in terms of performance. The big 51-pound Viking, it really dominates in the performance categories. However, it does not have the top spot in terms of total average, and the reason is I conduct another test for the 45-pounders that isn't present here, and that is the self-launching power. And the Viking anchors do not have, it's basically zero self-launching power, meaning when they're in their roller stowed with the shank about horizontal, if you let go of the chain, they just won't launch. And it's significant for larger boats with powered windlasses and potentially a crew won't be forward. But for the smaller anchors, I feel it is extremely unlikely for there to be a powered winch. So a crew member will always be forward, maybe even just launching them by hand. So that's the reason. Someone did ask me once why I did not include the self-launching power category for the small anchors, and that is why. So here's a list of 11 of the 13 anchors that we just viewed. And the thing that's unique about these 11 is I have previously conducted this exact same test with 45-pound versions of all of these anchors. So I have the 20-pounders ranked in order of their sort of composite performance in this test, meaning I took their quality of their Veer rank along with the quality of their straight line resistance rank and produced a pecking order best I could. And then as blind as I could, I did the same thing with their 45-pound range cousins and listed them. And we're going to notice a few patterns here. First of all, right at the top, the first 3 anchors are lock step, meaning a Bruce anchor in the 20-pound size or 45, it's the worst performer of this group. Rocna is the 2nd position and Delta is the 3rd. Now here in the middle of these lists, we see a little divergence, but not much. No more than 2 places will these anchors diverge from their pecking order. But then down at the bottom, we see things go back to perfect again. The M2 gets the number 10 spot, and then the very best anchor in this clean sand test, the Viking, 11 position, regardless if it's the 20-pound or 45-pound version. Now this might suggest a couple things. One is that all of these anchors appear to be scaling at a similar rate to each other. And the other thing it may suggest is that this test and protocol, well, it just appears to be fairly consistent. Okay, that's it for the 20-pounders with this clean sand Veer test. Some of you may have noticed a slowdown in the rate at which I am producing anchor test videos, and it is true. I am speaking now in the beginning of 2022. I did a tally. I conducted over 40 anchor test videos in 2021, so that's more than 3 per month, and that's pretty much a full-time job in addition to my for pay work that I do. And frankly, I can't keep that up. I'll be doing more of my day job, less anchor testing, but another significant factor is last summer, you may notice that Panopay did not get launched, so there was no sailing or no cruising. It was just head down, ass high anchor testing, and I'm going to do a little bit more R&R this summer. I'll take some anchors along and maybe conduct some tests farther afield. Okay, I'll keep the anchor tests coming. You guys keep the donations coming, and for the folks just watching and supporting me in any other way, thank you very much. We'll see you soon.